Welcome back to the I Take History with My Coffee podcast, where we explore history in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Emperor Charles V, abdication speech, 1555. Even before my last campaign to Germany, my lamentable state of health had led me to consider laying down the burden of public affairs. But the turmoil troubling Christendom caused me to abandon that plan in the hope of restoring peace. And since I did not then feel as weak as I do now, I considered it my duty to sacrifice to the welfare of my people whatever strength and life remained to me. The great hall of the Ducal Palace in Brussels had hosted many ceremonies. 40 years earlier, in this same room, a 15-year-old boy had been declared of age and presented to his subjects as their sovereign duke. They had cheered him then, this grandson of Burgundy, born among them, one of their own. Now the hall was packed again. The knights of the Golden Fleece in their robes, the councillors of the Netherlands, the provincial governors, and the great men of the land. 2 queens sat in attendance, Eleanor, the widow of the King of France, and Mary of Hungary, who had governed these provinces for the past quarter century. Philip, heir to everything, was present. So was a young nobleman, William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, not yet 22 years old. They watched the door. When it opened, the room fell silent. Charles entered, leaning on a cane, his right hand resting on the shoulder of the young Prince of Orange. He was 55, but he looked older. Gout had so ravaged his body that he could no longer walk unaided. He had been helped onto a mule to cross from his private apartments to the palace. His fingers, swollen beyond use, could no longer untie the strings of a document. He had recently joked about this with a French ambassador, recalling his youthful vanity with the sardonic humor of a man who had made his peace with who he had become. The most powerful man in the world, carried by a young prince who would one day lead a rebellion against his son. The Council of Philibert of Brussels rose and presented the formal reasons for the abdication. The emperor could no longer endure the cold in the Low Countries. His health was broken, and he was stepping down. Then Charles himself rose. He held notes, his habit throughout his life, even now. He spoke in French, the language of his Burgundian birthright, and reviewed his reign as though tallying a ledger. 40 years since that day of emancipation in this room. 9 journeys to Germany, 6 to Spain, 4 to France, twice to England, twice to Africa. He had sought to leave his people in peace, he said, but forces beyond his strength had prevented him. He spoke of the siege of Metz, the great failure of his later years, and said, quote, "I did what I could against my enemies, but the outcome of war lies in the hands of God, who grants or withholds victories as he sees fit." End quote. For any wrong he had done unwittingly, he asked, quote, "those present here today, as well as those who are absent, to forgive me." End quote. He wept. Everyone wept. the counselors, the governors, the queens. Philip stepped forward and knelt before his father. Charles raised him and embraced him. Philip then turned to address the assembly, and at that moment a telling detail occurred. He could not speak to them directly. He had to do so through a translator. The Bishop of Arras delivered his words on his behalf. Because Philip, heir to the Burgundian inheritance, could not speak their language. Charles noticed. He had always noticed. It is worth pausing here, because historians have not always taken this scene at face value. The tears, the ceremony, the carefully prepared speech. Some argue that the abdication was not the voluntary act of a prince laying down his burden, but a dynastic rearrangement dressed in the language of renunciation. Charles was not surrendering power. He was transferring it within the family on his own terms at a moment of his own choosing. On this reading, the weeping was itself a political act, a form of legitimization for Philip, a way of investing the transfer with emotional gravity that pure legal procedure could not supply. The skeptical reading is not exactly wrong, but it may raise a question that Charles himself would not have recognized. He was a man of the 16th century, formed in a world where ceremony was not a layer over reality, but the medium through which reality was constituted. The ritual was the thing, not a representation of it. When Charles wept in that hall, he was not performing grief while calculating dynastic advantage. He was doing both at once, because for him, they were not separable. What we can say is that the hall in Brussels that October afternoon was where 40 years of governing, the most complex inheritance in European history, came to a visible end, and that the man at the center of it had earned, whatever else we conclude, the right to weep. 6 years earlier, Charles had done everything he could to prepare his son for this moment. In 1548, he brought Philip north for a grand tour of the Habsburg territories, a formal introduction of the heir to his future subjects. The court ceremonial was carefully calibrated. Burgundian forms, not Castilian, were to govern the visit. Triumphal arches compared Philip to the victor of Tunis. Everything was arranged to present the Spanish prince as a natural heir to the Burgundian tradition. It did not work. Philip was perceived as haughty, stiff, and unable to read the room. Wine made him ill, and he fainted at a tournament. He preferred religious processions to the festive public culture that the Netherlanders expected of their ruler. No one in Charles's circle was better placed to assess what this meant than Mary of Hungary, who had governed the Netherlands since 1531 and understood its political temper with an intimacy even Charles, born here, could not match from a distance. Her private assessment of Philip was unsparing. He was temperamentally unsuited to the northern world he was expected to inherit, and the hope that time and experience would correct this was, in her judgment, unlikely to be realized. Charles proclaimed Philip his heir to the Netherlands on April 2nd, 1550, and expressed confidence that Philip would come to understand the land and its people. That confidence was an act of paternal will more than of political realism. It went unfulfilled. When Philip addressed the assembled estates at the abdication 6 years later and had to speak through a translator, it fulfilled what both Charles and Mary had already seen in 1549. The years between the tour and the abdication brought Charles a succession of failures that would have broken a younger man, and in a sense did break this one. The most damaging blow came in 1552. Charles had spent 30 years trying to hold the fabric of Christendom together against the twin pressures of Ottoman expansion and Protestant fragmentation. In the spring of that year, Maurice of Saxony, a Protestant prince whom Charles had cultivated and trusted, a man Charles had believed to be a reliable ally, betrayed him. Maurice had secretly concluded the Treaty of Chambord with Henry II of France, trading the imperial bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun for French military backing. In March 1552, Maurice's forces pushed through Germany and advanced on Innsbruck. Charles escaped the city with almost no military protection, fleeing through the Brenner Pass in a litter, in the dark, through snow. It was the most vulnerable moment of his entire reign. He recovered enough to strike back. France had seized Metz, which was strategically critical. It controlled the corridor linking the Netherlands to Alsace. If France consolidated its hold there and pushed toward the Rhine, the logic of the entire imperial inheritance began to unravel. In October 1552, Charles assembled an army and laid siege to the city. What he found inside Metz was Francis, Duke of Guise. Guise had spent months fortifying the city with characteristic energy and intelligence. When the imperial artillery breached the outer walls in late November, a second defensive line lay behind them, manned by sharpshooters. The outer suburbs, where the besieging army had hoped to shelter through the winter, had been burned. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do but stand in the open as the cold closed in. The siege failed in early 1553. Disease swept through the Spanish and Italian troops with brutal efficiency. The army dissolved not from defeat in battle, but from the slow attrition of a winter it could not survive. Charles himself was present, traveling by litter, watching it unfold. Mary of Hungary had correctly advised against the winter siege from the outset. The Duke of Alva, who had urged it, bore the brunt of the troops' anger after the withdrawal. The siege of Metz was the moment when Charles, at some level beneath conscious articulation, understood the providential mission he had carried since his coronation, the defense of Christendom, the unity of the faith, the empire as God's instrument, was not going to be completed. It was going to be handed to his son unfinished, perhaps unfinishable. The years after Metz brought further disintegration. The Peace of Augsburg, concluded in September 1555, formally established that a territory's religion would be determined by its ruler, a settlement Charles regarded as a betrayal of everything he had fought for. Reached without his attendance and over his private protests by his brother Ferdinand. Charles lodged a formal objection to its terms and then stepped back, leaving Ferdinand to manage what he could not accept. There were personal losses as well. His mother, Joanna, who had been confined to her castle at Tordesillas for nearly 50 years, died in April 1555. The English dynastic scheme, the marriage of Philip to Mary Tudor, intended to link the Netherlands to England and encircle France permanently, had quietly collapsed with Mary's failure to produce an heir. The northern strategy that had consumed so much of his attention in his final years had come to nothing. By autumn 1555, Charles was traveling in a litter. His gout had progressed to the point that his fingers were too swollen to hold the strings of a document. He laughed about it with the French ambassador Coligny, a stoic, self-aware humor that had always been one of his more attractive qualities. He had decided. The machinery of abdication was already in motion. The transfer of power was not a single act, but a sequence, carefully ordered by political significance and constitutional requirements. It began on October 22nd, 3 days before the Great Brussels ceremony, when Charles renounced his sovereignty over the Order of the Golden Fleece, the symbolic heart of Burgundian identity, the order his great-grandfather, Philip the Good, had founded, and the brotherhood that bound the great nobles of the Netherlands to their duke. This was the first domino. October 25th was in Brussels. The ceremony we had already witnessed, with its tears, its speech, and Philip's translated words. 4 days later, Charles formally resigned the county of Burgundy itself. On January 16th, 1556, the Spanish abdication took place, and its character could not have been more different than that of Brussels. This was not a public ceremony in a great hall. Charles conducted it in his private apartments, in a gathering small enough to feel intimate, almost funerary. The notaries read the formal renunciations, Castile, Leon, and the Indies in Spanish, Aragon, the islands, and Sicily in Latin. Charles handed Philip a casket containing his will and its codicils. He cited St. Augustine on the nature of testaments, that a will takes effect only upon the testator's death. He was quietly signaling that he did not expect to live long. He laid down the masterships of the three great Spanish military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, and they passed to his son. The imperial title was a different matter entirely, and its resolution, or rather its failure to resolve, was the quiet defeat at the heart of the abdication sequence. For the better part of a decade, Charles had pursued his scheme to keep the imperial crown within the Spanish line. Philip would succeed Ferdinand as emperor, and Maximilian, Ferdinand's son, would follow Philip. It was the central dynastic ambition of Charles's later reign, the thread he had pulled at the Diet of Augsburg in 1550 and 1551, pressuring his brother in private meetings and through intermediaries, arguing the case with a persistence that bordered on obsession. Ferdinand refused. Maximilian, arriving in Augsburg in December 1550, avoided Philip entirely and made his position clear through studied indifference. The written compromise of March 1551, in which Ferdinand agreed in principle to support Philip's eventual election, was a face-saving fiction that neither side believed. It withered before it could be presented to the electors. By October 1555, Charles had nothing left to negotiate. the imperial title passed to Ferdinand by letter, with formal electoral recognition delayed until February 1558. Charles was already at Yusta by then. The plan to permanently bind the empire to the Spanish line was set aside, without ceremony or acknowledgement, as though it had never been proposed. In the end, the most consequential thing Charles transferred in Brussels was not the empire. It was everything else. On October 28th, 1556, Charles and Philip met for the last time in Ghent, the city where Charles had been born nearly 60 years earlier in the Prinsenhof Palace. They would never see each other again. There is something almost too neat about the geography of it. The birthplace as the farewell. Charles had spent his entire reign in motion, crossing and recrossing the map of his inheritance, and now that motion was ending where it had begun. Philip was 29, already King of Spain, Naples, and the Netherlands, and shortly to be the most powerful monarch in Europe. Charles was 56, moving toward a monastery in the Spanish interior, toward silence, prayer, and the sound of water in the garden he had specified for the monks at Yusta. What passed between them at their parting is not recorded. What we know is that Charles boarded his fleet in Zealand shortly after and did not look back. 26 ships sailed south along France's Atlantic coast and around the Iberian Peninsula. Charles stood on the prow of his flagship. He was going home to die, though he would live another 2 years, longer than anyone, including himself, expected. They disembarked at Laredo on September 28th and began the slow journey south. Charles took a route that wound through places he had known in earlier, better times. Seville, where he had been happy with his wife Isabella, and Granada, where they had spent the first years of their marriage. He was moving through the geography of his past, visiting it one last time. He arrived at Yusta on February 5th, 1557, and never left again. Before he left Brussels, Charles had written down what he knew. The instructions he gave to Philip, compiled from a tradition of such documents he had issued since Philip was a boy, now gathered and refined for the moment of final handover, distilled 40 years of governing the most complex inheritance in Europe. He wrote about power and how it worked, about the difference between a prince who is loved and one who is feared, and why that difference is not merely a moral nicety, but a political fact with consequences. Quote, even though people may for a time be oppressed by fear or driven about as if by the violence of a harsh government, such a thing cannot last long. And such a wretched ruler gives cause for people to think day and night of ways and means to be rid of the yoke. People are also minded that once they have found a lord who is more powerful and who can protect and defend them against the other, they can never be brought back under their former authority. For one tends to hate him whom one fears. End quote. He wrote about money, about the two ways a prince can raise it, one with the people's goodwill and the other by compulsion, and why the second path, though sometimes necessary, carries a cost that accumulates. Quote, the ever-continuing pain that arises from it tends to bring with it eternal hatred toward the prince, which moreover grows from day to day. A prince must also pay careful attention to servants and tax collectors, so that the people are not driven to despair by their excessively harsh and violent exactions. For they can endure the injustice of such people far less than the very burdens imposed upon them by the prince. And from this dangerous uprisings and rebellions tend to arise. End quote. He wrote about governing people who were not like you, the importance of consultation, presence, and understanding the political culture of the lands you ruled, rather than imposing your own upon them. He had spent 40 years learning this. He had not always succeeded, but he had learned it. Philip received the instructions. He read them or had them read to him. He took them seriously in his way. He was a conscientious man, working long hours and believing himself to be governing well and in accordance with his duty before God. He was not a fool, and he was not, in his own estimation, cruel. And then, over the years that followed, he did almost the opposite of what his father had told him. The taxes levied by compulsion, the governors who drove people to despair, the yoke that kept subjects thinking day and night of ways to get rid of it. Charles had named each of these dangers. He had seen them coming 40 years before they arrived. He had handed his son the map and watched him set it down. That is where we will begin in the next episode. As always, maps and other supporting resources for all episodes are listed in the episode description. In the meantime, for more historical content, become a free or paid subscriber on Substack and get it all delivered to your inbox. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Feedback and comments are welcome at itakehistory@gmail.com, or you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. You can also help support this podcast by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/itakehistory. If you know anyone else who would enjoy this podcast, please let them know. And thanks for listening.